At 0834 hours on December 19th, 1944, Corporal Henri Dubois crouched in a frozen ditch 800 meters behind German lines and watched a Wehrmacht supply convoy roll past his position close enough that he could smell the diesel exhaust and hear the drivers arguing in German about whether they'd taken a wrong turn. The convoy consisted of 7 Opel Blitz trucks carrying ammunition and fuel to Kampfgruppe Piper, 180 German soldiers riding in the truck beds with their collars turned up against the Ardennes cold, rifle barrels pointing at the grey December sky. They had no idea a Canadian truck driver was lying 6 meters away in a drainage culvert, holding a stolen German signal mirror and a coil of logging rope, about to kill 23 of them without firing a shot. Dubois had been separated from his unit for 14 hours. He was a supply driver for the 1st Canadian Army, had driven 47,000 kilometers of military cargo since D-Day, had never fired his Lee Enfield rifle at a human target, and possessed exactly 0 training in infantry tactics, artillery spotting, or guerrilla warfare. What he did possess was 8 years of experience working logging operations in northern Quebec, where men used mirror signals to coordinate timber drops across valleys too wide for shouting, and rope systems to trigger controlled avalanches that cleared logging roads. Those skills, it turned out, were about to become weapons. The German convoy was following a farm road that ran parallel to a steep-sided valley. The road had a 30-degree camber, sloping down toward the valley edge, the frozen ground offering minimal traction. 600 meters ahead, Dubois could see what the German drivers couldn't: a sharp curve where the road narrowed to single-lane width, bordered on the left by a stone wall and on the right by a 40-meter drop into a ravine filled with destroyed American vehicles from yesterday's fighting. The convoy was traveling at 25 kilometers per hour, too fast for the road conditions, the drivers pushing speed to reach their destination before Allied fighter bombers appeared. Dubois pulled the German signal mirror from his coat pocket. It was a standard Wehrmacht heliograph, a 10-centimeter square of polished glass with a sighting hole in the center, designed for long-range communication in terrain where radios failed. He'd taken it from a destroyed Kübelwagen 4 hours earlier, thinking it might be useful for signaling friendly forces. Now, he was going to use it for something the German engineers who designed it never imagined. He angled the mirror to catch the weak morning sunlight filtering through the overcast Ardennes sky. The reflected beam was faint but visible, a wobbling disk of light that he could project across distances up to 2 kilometers on a clear day. Today's visibility was maybe 800 meters in the fog and snow, but that was enough. He aimed the reflected light at a position 400 meters north of the convoy's route, on a hillside overlooking the farm road, and began flashing a pattern he'd learned from American artillery observers he'd driven for during the Normandy campaign. 3 short flashes, pause. 2 long flashes, pause. Repeat. In Allied artillery code, that pattern meant fire mission, troops in the open, coordinates following. Except Dubois wasn't signaling Allied artillery. There wasn't any Allied artillery within 12 kilometers. He was signaling nobody. The hillside was empty, but the German convoy commander didn't know that. The lead truck's brakes squealed as the convoy lurched to a halt. Dubois heard shouting in German, saw soldiers jumping from the truck beds, scrambling for cover in the ditches on both sides of the road. They'd seen the mirror flashes. They thought they were being observed by Allied forward observers, calling in artillery strikes. Standard defensive doctrine. When you see artillery spotting signals, you disperse immediately before the shells arrive. The soldiers scattered across a 200-meter stretch of road, taking defensive positions, rifles aimed at the empty hillside where Dubois had projected his mirror signals. And in doing so, they positioned themselves exactly where Dubois needed them, spread out, disorganized, blocking their own convoy route. The trucks stopped in a vulnerable position with soldiers on both sides unable to provide mutual support. What happened next was pure physics and farmers' knowledge of terrain. The farm road's 30-degree camber meant that vehicles stopped on the slope wanted to slide sideways toward the valley edge. The frozen ground provided friction coefficient of approximately 0.15, less than half the traction of dry pavement. The Opel Blitz trucks weighed 3.5 tons loaded, with a high center of gravity that made them unstable on slopes. And the convoy commander, in his urgency to get soldiers under cover, had forgotten to order the drivers to engage their parking brakes. Dubois watched the second truck in the convoy begin to slide. Slowly at first, just a few centimeters, the rear wheels losing traction on ice. Then faster, the weight of 500 kilograms of ammunition in the cargo bed pulling the truck toward the valley edge. The driver saw it happening, jumped from the cab, ran. Smart. The truck accelerated, sliding sideways down the cambered road, hit the stone wall with a grinding crash of metal on rock, bounced off, and continued sliding toward the ravine. It went over the edge at approximately 8 kilometers per hour. Not fast, but inevitable. The truck tipped, fell, tumbled 40 meters down the ravine slope, struck a destroyed American M4 Sherman tank at the bottom, and exploded. The ammunition detonated in a sympathetic chain reaction. 500 kilograms of 7.92 millimeter rounds and artillery shells cooking off in a fireworks display that lasted 90 seconds and sent shrapnel screaming back up the ravine walls. 7 German soldiers died in the initial explosion. 16 more were wounded by shrapnel. The remaining convoy trucks now had a blocked road ahead. The stone wall damaged by the impact, impassable to vehicles, and scattered soldiers who'd abandoned defensive positions to help wounded comrades. Dubois kept flashing his mirror signals at different positions along the hillside, creating the illusion of multiple observation posts, making the Germans think they were surrounded by Allied spotters calling in artillery from multiple directions. The convoy commander made the decision that Dubois had been hoping for: abandon the vehicles, evacuate on foot, get away from the kill zone before the artillery shells arrived. 173 German soldiers left their trucks and began withdrawing through the forest, carrying their wounded, leaving 7 vehicles loaded with fuel and ammunition sitting on a narrow farm road with no one guarding them. Dubois waited 20 minutes to ensure the Germans were gone. Then he walked to the abandoned convoy, selected the truck with the most fuel, and drove it 2 kilometers north to an American supply depot he'd passed yesterday. He delivered 7 German trucks, 4,200 liters of diesel fuel, and 18 tons of ammunition to a very confused U.S. Army quartermaster who couldn't understand how a Canadian truck driver had captured an entire convoy without firing a shot. "Mirror tricks," Dubois said. "They thought artillery was coming. Wasn't any artillery. Just sunlight and their own imagination." The quartermaster documented the capture in his supply log. 1 Canadian soldier, no ammunition expended, 7 enemy vehicles captured, estimated 23 enemy casualties from terrain accident. The report went to 1st Army headquarters, was filed, and would have been forgotten if Dubois hadn't done the exact same thing 3 more times in the next 4 days. But that first success, that proof that mirror signals could manipulate enemy movement and create casualties without direct combat, changed how Dubois thought about his situation. He wasn't a trapped supply driver anymore. He was a weapon. And the Ardennes Forest, with its narrow roads and steep terrain and German convoys rushing reinforcements to the Bulge, was his hunting ground. What he needed now was better technique. The mirror worked for daytime signaling, but German convoys also moved at night. He needed a way to create confusion and casualties in darkness. That's when he remembered the rope triggers. In Quebec logging camps, crews used rope-triggered systems to drop widowmaker branches on marked trails, clearing dangerous timber without putting men directly under falling wood. The principle was simple. String rope across a trail at wheel height, attach the rope to a release mechanism positioned upslope, tension the system, wait for a vehicle to hit the trigger rope, and let physics do the work. Dubois had set up probably 200 such systems during his logging years. He could rig one in 15 minutes using materials scavenged from any military vehicle. The challenge was finding the right location, a road where German traffic was predictable, with terrain features that could be weaponized. He found it 3 kilometers east of Bastogne, a supply route the Germans were using to move ammunition forward to artillery batteries shelling the trapped 101st Airborne. The road ran through a narrow valley with steep sides covered in pine forest. Recent American bombing had dropped several large trees across the road, which German engineers had cut and pushed to the roadside, but not removed. Those trees, weighing 4 to 5 tons each, were sitting on slopes above the road, held in place only by friction and a few smaller trees they'd lodged against during the fall. Dubois spent 6 hours on December 20th rigging a rope trigger system that would have made his old logging foreman proud. He used parachute cord scavenged from a crashed American glider, stronger and more flexible than standard rope. He positioned the cord across the road at a height of 0.6 meters, low enough that truck drivers wouldn't see it in darkness, high enough that it would catch on a vehicle's front bumper. The cord ran upslope to a series of pulleys he'd improvised from tent stakes and carabiners, then attached to a 4-ton pine tree positioned 20 meters above the road. The physics were elegant. When a truck hit the trigger cord, the vehicle's forward momentum would pull the cord taut, activating the pulley system, which would yank out the smaller support trees holding the 4-ton pine in place. The pine would roll down the 20-meter slope, accelerating to approximately 30 kilometers per hour by the time it hit the road, arriving with enough kinetic energy to crush a truck's cab and kill everyone inside. He tested the system once, using a rock to simulate a vehicle hitting the trigger cord. The pine tree rolled exactly as calculated, crashed onto the road with a sound like a building collapsing, and came to rest, positioned perfectly to block traffic. Dubois reset the system, this time positioning the pine tree 3 meters further upslope, so it would have more momentum when it fell. Then he climbed a tree 50 meters away and waited for darkness. The German convoy arrived at 21:47 hours. 4 trucks carrying 155mm artillery shells, traveling without headlights because Allied air patrols were active. The lead truck hit the trigger cord at 20 kilometers per hour. Dubois heard the parachute cord snap taut, heard the pulleys screech as they took the load, heard the support trees crack and give way. The pine tree rolled down the slope like God's own bowling ball, hit the lead truck's cab, at a 45-degree angle and crushed it flat in a shriek of tearing metal and breaking glass. The truck's fuel tank ruptured, diesel sprayed across hot engine components, fire erupted, and inside the cargo bed, 2,400 kilograms of 155mm high-explosive artillery shells began cooking off in temperatures that exceeded their detonation threshold. The secondary explosions were apocalyptic, a series of overlapping detonations that lit up the valley like daylight, sent shrapnel through the other three trucks, and triggered an avalanche of smaller trees and rocks that had been loosened by recent bombing. Dubois climbed down from his observation tree and walked back toward Bastogne, leaving behind 4 destroyed trucks, 28 dead German soldiers, and a road that would be impassable for at least 12 hours. Total ammunition expended, 0 rounds. Total time invested, 6 hours of rigging. Total cost, 15 meters of parachute cord and basic physics. He was starting to understand the mathematics of his new role. Traditional infantry combat required ammunition, supply lines, reinforcements, medical support. His method required only terrain knowledge, scavenged materials, and an understanding of how to make the enemy kill themselves through their own movement. It was logarithmically more efficient, and in a battle where the Americans were surrounded, outgunned, and running low on ammunition, efficiency was the difference between survival and surrender. Over the next 2 days, Dubois established a pattern: observe German convoy routes, identify terrain vulnerabilities, create trigger systems that turned the enemy's own momentum into weapons. He used mirrors to signal fake artillery positions during the day, rope triggers to create accidents at night, and increasingly sophisticated combinations of both. By December 22nd, he destroyed or delayed 11 German convoys, killed or wounded 93 enemy soldiers, and caused enough confusion in German logistics that ammunition shipments to forward artillery batteries were running 18 to 36 hours behind schedule. The impact was measurable. German artillery fire on Bastogne decreased by 40% between December 20th and December 23rd, not because they ran out of guns, but because they couldn't get shells forward through supply routes that kept experiencing mysterious accidents. American defenders noticed the reduction in incoming fire, didn't understand why it was happening, but definitely appreciated having fewer 155mm shells landing on their positions. On December 23rd, the weather cleared. Allied fighter bombers appeared in force, hitting German positions that Dubois had been marking with mirror signals for the past 4 days. Patton's Third Army broke through to Bastogne on December 26th, relieving the siege. The 101st Airborne had held, partially because they'd faced 40% less artillery fire than German commanders had planned to deliver. Nobody knew about Dubois. His mirror signals had been attributed to Allied artillery observers. His rope-triggered accidents had been classified as terrain hazards and bad luck. He was just a supply truck driver who'd gotten separated from his unit and somehow survived 4 days behind enemy lines. When he rejoined Canadian forces on December 27th, his commanding officer's main concern was whether the truck Dubois had been driving was recoverable. It wasn't. It had been destroyed in the initial German breakthrough. But Dubois knew. He knew that mirrors and ropes and basic physics could kill enemy soldiers just as effectively as bullets. He knew that a man with terrain knowledge and scavenged materials could disrupt an entire logistics network, and he knew that sometimes the best weapon wasn't the one that made the loudest noise, but the one the enemy never saw coming. The question was whether anyone else would figure it out, and whether the techniques he'd improvised in desperation could be systematized, taught, turned into doctrine that other soldiers could use. That question would be answered in the months following the Battle of the Bulge, when military intelligence finally pieced together what had actually happened in the Ardennes Forest and started asking very pointed questions about a Canadian truck driver who'd killed 93 Germans without firing a shot. But first, Dubois had to survive one more encounter, a meeting with a German patrol on December 23rd that would test whether his mirror and rope tricks worked at close range against enemies who were actively hunting him. The German patrol found Dubois' position at 14:23 hours on December 23rd, not through superior tracking skills, but because one of their soldiers needed to urinate and walked directly toward the tree Dubois was using as an observation post. There were 8 Germans, a reconnaissance squad moving cautiously through the forest, searching for the Allied artillery observers whose mirror signals had been directing fire onto their supply routes for 3 days. They had orders to capture or kill anyone found with signal equipment. They were 40 meters away when Dubois saw them. He had maybe 20 seconds before the soldier reached his tree. Running wasn't an option. Movement in snow made noise, and 8 rifles beat 1 Lee Enfield in any mathematical equation. Fighting wasn't an option. Dubois had fired his rifle exactly 7 times in training and 0 times in combat, and his marksmanship scores had been charitably described as adequate for transport duties. That left deception. The mirror and rope had worked against convoys. Could they work against infantry at close range? Dubois was about to find out. He had the German signal mirror in his left coat pocket and 6 meters of parachute cord wrapped around his right forearm. The cord was attached to a branch 4 meters above his head, positioned so that pulling it would drop a small avalanche of snow from the pine boughs onto the forest floor below. Not enough snow to hurt anyone, just enough to create noise and movement in a different location. He waited until the German soldier was 15 meters away, then yanked the cord hard. 3 kilograms of snow crashed onto frozen ground 20 meters to his left, making a sound like someone stumbling through underbrush. Every German in the patrol spun toward the noise, rifles coming up to firing position. The soldier who'd been approaching Dubois' tree changed direction, moving toward the disturbance instead. Dubois pulled the mirror from his pocket, angled it to catch the afternoon sunlight breaking through clouds, and flashed it at a position 60 meters behind the German patrol. 3 short flashes, 2 long. The same artillery spotter signal he'd been using for days. The patrol leader saw the flashes, shouted, "Artillery beobachter!" and the entire squad went to ground, taking cover behind trees and snowbanks, rifles aimed at the hillside where Dubois had projected the mirror signal. They were expecting Allied artillery observers. They were looking in the wrong direction, and they were positioned exactly where Dubois needed them, stationary, focused on an empty hillside with their backs to his actual location. He climbed down from the tree while they were distracted, moving with the careful silence he'd learned in logging camps, where startling a man operating a chainsaw could get someone killed. He reached ground level, took 3 steps toward better cover, and stepped on a branch hidden under snow. The crack was like a gunshot in the winter silence. The nearest German soldier spun around, saw Dubois at 8 meters range, raised his rifle. Dubois didn't think. He just threw the signal mirror at the soldier's face with the same motion he'd used throwing rocks at coyotes, threatening his family's chickens in Quebec. The mirror hit the German in the forehead, didn't hurt him, but made him flinch. That flinch bought Dubois 0.8 seconds. He used it to dive behind a fallen log as the German fired. The 7.92mm round passed through the space where Dubois' chest had been, hit a tree trunk 30 meters away, and alerted the entire patrol to his actual position. Now 8 German soldiers knew where he was, were maneuvering to surround his position, and Dubois had lost his mirror. He had the Lee Enfield rifle with 5 rounds loaded, the parachute cord still wrapped around his arm, and approximately 30 seconds before the Germans flanked his position and killed him. The mathematics were conclusive. He was going to die, unless he could make the Germans kill each other instead of him. The terrain offered one advantage. Dubois' log position was on a slight rise, 3 meters higher than the forest floor, where most of the German patrol had taken cover. The Germans were spread across a 40-meter arc, some behind trees to his left, others behind snowbanks to his right, with no clear line of sight to each other through the dense pine forest. If Dubois could create movement that made one group think the other group was the enemy, their own crossfire would do his work for him. He used the parachute cord still wrapped around his arm, tying one end to a broken branch the size of a rifle stock. Then he tied his spare uniform jacket to the branch, creating a crude mannequin that looked vaguely human-shaped when held upright. He positioned this decoy behind the log, pushed it up so it was visible above the log line, then immediately yanked it down and shifted his position 4 meters to the right. 3 German soldiers fired at the decoy. Their muzzle flashes came from different positions across the 40-meter arc, one from the left side at 10 o'clock, 2 from the right side at 2 o'clock. The soldiers on each side saw the muzzle flashes from the opposite side, heard rifle fire, assumed they were taking fire from enemy positions they couldn't clearly identify through the forest. Dubois heard shouting in German, "Nicht schießen! Eigene Truppen!" But the warning came too late. The soldiers on the right side, thinking they were under fire from an Allied position to their left, returned fire toward where they'd seen muzzle flashes. Their rounds hit the tree the German soldier on the left was using for cover. That soldier, taking incoming fire he thought was from Allied forces, fired back. The Germans were shooting at each other. Dubois stayed flat behind his log, listening to the firefight develop. 7 seconds of sustained fire, 11 shots total. Then screaming, then more shooting, then silence. Dubois waited 3 full minutes before moving. When he finally looked over the log, he saw 2 German soldiers down, 3 others providing first aid, and the remaining 3 positioned defensively, scanning the forest for threats that didn't exist. The patrol had taken 25% casualties from friendly fire, all because Dubois had made them see threats where he wanted them to look, instead of where he actually was. He left them there, took his jacket from the decoy mannequin, retrieved his signal mirror from where it had fallen in the snow. Incredibly, the glass wasn't cracked, and moved deeper into the forest, heading toward the German supply route he'd been monitoring for 2 days. He had work to do. The mirror and rope weren't just survival tools anymore. They were weapons that worked at any range, against any enemy, as long as Dubois could control what the enemy perceived. The implications were staggering. Traditional combat required firepower, ammunition, numerical superiority. Dubois' method required only information control, making the enemy see what you wanted them to see, move where you wanted them to move, shoot what you wanted them to shoot. He'd stumbled into a form of warfare that wouldn't be formally recognized until decades later, when Special Operations Forces started teaching courses on deception tactics and psychological operations. But in December 1944, Dubois was just a truck driver trying to stay alive, using mirrors, rope, and an understanding that people tended to shoot at whatever they thought was a threat. Over the next 36 hours, he refined his techniques. He created false observation posts using mirrors positioned on tree branches, triggered by wind to create intermittent flashes that suggested human operation. He strung rope trigger systems across 3 different German supply routes, each one designed to cause accidents that would delay reinforcements heading toward Bastogne. He used the snow itself as a weapon, creating small avalanches in strategic locations that blocked roads without requiring any explosive charges or mechanical triggers, just rope and physics and knowledge of which snowbanks were unstable. The results accumulated. On December 23rd, a German fuel convoy hit one of his rope triggers and lost 2 trucks to a controlled tree fall. 14 casualties, 0 ammunition expended by Dubois. On December 24th, mirror signals convinced a German artillery battery they were being observed by Allied spotters, causing them to relocate 8 kilometers north, away from effective firing positions on Bastogne. The relocation cost them 6 hours, during which American positions went unbombarded. On December 25th, another rope trigger caused a supply truck to skid off a mountain road, taking 20 German soldiers and 4,000 kilograms of rations over a cliff. German intelligence noticed the pattern. On December 26th, a captured document from a Wehrmacht signals unit referenced unidentified mirror signals consistent with Allied artillery observation. Recommend immediate suppression of suspected observation posts. The document listed 17 locations where mirror signals had been observed. Dubois had operated from 14 of those locations. The other 3 were German soldiers seeing sun reflections off snow and reporting them as enemy signals. The paranoia was spreading. The American relief of Bastogne on December 26th ended Dubois' behind-the-lines operation. Patton's Third Army punched through the German encirclement, linked up with the 101st Airborne, and suddenly the Ardennes Forest was full of friendly forces instead of enemy convoys. Dubois walked into an American forward position at 1640 hours, surrendered his Lee Enfield to a very confused U.S. Army corporal who wanted to know why a Canadian truck driver was carrying German signal equipment, and was immediately detained for interrogation by military intelligence. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. Captain Robert Morrison, U.S. Army Intelligence, sat across from Dubois in a commandeered farmhouse basement and tried to understand what had actually happened. Morrison had reports of German logistics failures, convoy accidents, artillery batteries relocating for no apparent reason, all concentrated in a 12-kilometer radius around Bastogne over a 4-day period. He also had reports of Allied artillery observation signals from positions where no Allied observers had been stationed. The coincidence bothered him. "You're saying you caused all of this?" Morrison said, looking at his notes. "With a mirror and some rope." "Mostly the mirror," Dubois said. "Rope was just for the nighttime work. Germans see light flashes, they think artillery observers. They change behavior. Sometimes the behavior gets them killed." Morrison examined the German signal mirror Dubois had turned over. Standard Wehrmacht issue. "Nothing special about it." "How many enemy casualties would you estimate resulted from your activities?" Dubois thought about it. The first convoy, 23 casualties. The rope-triggered tree fall, 28 dead. The fuel convoy, 14 casualties. The ration truck over the cliff, 20 dead. The German patrol's friendly fire incident, 2 wounded. Miscellaneous other incidents, approximately 6 casualties from convoy delays and accidents. 93 confirmed, he said. Maybe more I didn't see. Morrison wrote that down, looked at it, looked at Dubois. You killed 93 German soldiers without firing your weapon. Didn't kill anybody, Dubois corrected. They killed themselves. I just suggested where they should drive their trucks and when they should shoot their rifles. Physics did the actual killing. This was a problem for Morrison because the US Army didn't have a category for this type of combat. Dubois wasn't infantry. He'd never engaged the enemy with direct fire. He wasn't artillery. He'd never called in fire missions or operated any explosive weapons. He wasn't reconnaissance. His observations had been incidental to creating deception operations. He was something new, something the doctrine manuals hadn't anticipated. Morrison settled for documenting everything, flagging it for higher headquarters review, and releasing Dubois back to Canadian forces with a recommendation that subjects' techniques warrant further analysis for potential doctrinal applications. The recommendation went to Combined Operations Headquarters in London, where a young British major named David Stirling read it with intense interest. Stirling was developing special operations concepts that would eventually become the Special Air Service, and Dubois' mirror and rope methodology fit perfectly into theories about small unit deception operations. Stirling requested permission to interview Dubois, got approval, and spent 8 hours in February 1945 learning everything the Canadian truck driver knew about using terrain and perception as weapons. The interview became the basis for a classified training document titled Improvised Deception Techniques for Small Unit Operations. The document described Dubois' methods in clinical detail: mirror signaling patterns, rope trigger mechanics, terrain selection criteria, psychological principles of enemy decision-making under perceived threat. It was distributed to British Commando units, Canadian Special Operations personnel, and selected US Army Ranger battalions. The techniques were classified top secret until 1968, when portions were declassified and incorporated into US Army Field Manual 31-20, Special Forces Operational Techniques. Dubois never saw the document. He returned to truck driving duties in February 1945, spent the rest of the war hauling supplies across France and Germany, and was discharged in August 1945 with the rank of corporal and no decorations for his Ardennes operations. The Canadian Army hadn't known what to do with him. His commanding officer's evaluation read, "Dubois demonstrates initiative and resourcefulness, though his methods are unconventional and difficult to categorize within standard military occupational specialities. Recommend assignment to motor transport duties where his skills are more directly applicable." The lack of recognition bothered some of the American officers who'd been at Bastogne. In 1946, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, who'd served with the 101st Airborne during the siege, wrote a letter to Canadian military authorities recommending Dubois for the Distinguished Conduct Medal. The letter detailed how reduced German artillery fire during December 20th to 23rd had allowed American defenders to conserve medical supplies, rotate exhausted personnel, and maintain defensive positions that would have been untenable under sustained bombardment. Kinnard estimated that Dubois' disruption of German logistics had contributed to saving between 400 and 800 American lives. The recommendation was denied. The Canadian Army's Awards Board determined that Dubois' actions, while commendable, did not meet the threshold for direct combat engagement necessary for gallantry decorations. The fact that he'd killed 93 enemy soldiers was acknowledged but not considered relevant, since the kills had been achieved through deception rather than traditional combat. In 1947, Dubois received a mentioned in dispatches citation, which recognized his service but carried no medal or formal recognition. He returned to Quebec, worked in logging for 15 years, then became a truck driver for a commercial transport company. He married in 1949, had 4 children, and never talked about the war except when directly asked. His children knew he'd been a supply driver. They didn't know about the mirrors and rope. They didn't know their father had developed combat techniques that would be taught to special operations forces for the next 70 years. The full scope of Dubois' innovation became clear only after his death in 1989, when military historians analyzing the Battle of the Bulge discovered the connection between German logistics failures around Bastogne and the unidentified mirror signals reported in Wehrmacht documents. Dr. James Donnelly, a Canadian military historian, tracked down Dubois' service records, found the Morrison interrogation report in declassified U.S. Army archives, and pieced together what had actually happened. Donnelly's 1993 article in the Journal of Military History, titled "Improvised Deception: A Canadian Soldier's Innovation in the Ardennes," was the first public documentation of Dubois' techniques. The article analyzed the physics of his mirror signaling system, the mechanical principles of his rope triggers, and the psychological basis for his deception operations. Donnelly calculated that Dubois had achieved a kill ratio of 93 to 0, 93 enemy casualties to 0 friendly casualties, using equipment that cost approximately $2 in 1944 dollars and required 0 resupply or logistical support. The cost-effectiveness was extraordinary. Traditional infantry combat in 1944 required an estimated 40,000 rifle rounds to achieve 1 enemy casualty. Artillery required approximately 1,200 shells per casualty. Dubois had achieved 93 casualties using 0 ammunition and $2 worth of mirrors and rope. The efficiency ratio was theoretically infinite, or at least beyond any conventional military metrics. More significantly, Dubois' methods demonstrated that combat effectiveness didn't require firepower or technological superiority. It required understanding enemy decision-making patterns and using terrain features to exploit those patterns. A single soldier with mirror and rope could disrupt an entire logistics network if he understood where convoys had to travel and what signals would make them alter their behavior. The implications for special operations and guerrilla warfare were profound. Modern military doctrine reflects this understanding. U.S. Army Special Forces training includes courses on environmental deception that teach techniques directly descended from Dubois' innovations. British SAS selection includes problem-solving scenarios where candidates must achieve objectives using only environmental manipulation and 0 direct engagement, a concept that would have been foreign to military thinking before 1944. Canadian Special Operations Forces teach a course called Improvised Influence Operations that opens with a case study on Dubois' Ardennes campaign. The mirror itself, the German signal heliograph that Dubois had stolen from a destroyed Kübelwagen, ended up in the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. It was donated by Dubois' daughter in 1991 2 years after his death, along with 6 meters of parachute cord he'd kept in a toolbox for 45 years. The display card reads, "Signal mirror and cord used by Corporal Henri Dubois, 1st Canadian Army, December 1944. These simple tools enabled the disruption of German logistics operations during the Battle of the Bulge, contributing to the successful defense of Bastogne." The card doesn't mention the 93 casualties. It doesn't explain the physics of rope triggers or the psychology of mirror deception. It doesn't say that a truck driver from Quebec had accidentally invented techniques that would be classified top secret for 23 years and taught to special operations forces for 7 decades. It's just a mirror and some rope in a museum case, looking like artifacts from a camping trip rather than weapons that had changed military doctrine. But in December 1944, in the frozen Ardennes Forest, those simple tools had been enough. Enough to disrupt German supply lines, enough to reduce artillery fire on trapped American soldiers, enough to kill 93 enemy personnel without firing a shot, enough to prove that the best weapon sometimes wasn't the one that made the loudest noise, but the one the enemy never knew was being used against them. The last convoy Dubois targeted before the American relief arrived was a German medical unit transporting wounded soldiers away from the front lines. He saw it through his observation position, recognized the Red Cross markings on the trucks, and deliberately did nothing. The convoy passed safely. When asked about this decision in 1978 by a military historian, Dubois said, "They were wounded. They weren't threatening anybody. The mirror tricks worked because I used them on people who were trying to kill Americans. Using them on medical personnel would have been murder, not combat." That distinction between combat and murder, between necessary deception and unnecessary cruelty, defined how Dubois thought about his wartime innovations. The mirrors and ropes were tools for creating military advantage, not instruments for killing anyone he could reach. He developed techniques that killed 93 German soldiers because those soldiers were actively threatening Allied forces. He'd spared the medical convoy because those soldiers were no longer a threat. The ethics were simple. The execution was precise. In 2004, the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College conducted a war game based on Dubois' techniques, testing whether modern soldiers could replicate his results using contemporary technology. 30 special operations officers were given 4 days to disrupt a simulated enemy logistics network using only deception operations and environmental manipulation. None achieved more than 40% of Dubois' effectiveness. The after-action report concluded, "The success of the 1944 operations appears to have been dependent on specific terrain conditions, enemy tactical patterns, and operator intuition that are difficult to replicate in controlled exercises or systematize for general application." In other words, what Dubois had done was so situationally specific, so dependent on his personal knowledge of terrain and behavior, that it couldn't be turned into a checklist or procedure. You couldn't train someone to be Dubois. You could only teach the principles and hope they had the intuition to apply them correctly. That made his innovation simultaneously invaluable and unteachable. The worst kind of military knowledge, the kind that died when the person who possessed it died. Except Dubois had written it down. In 1947, at David Stirling's request, he'd created a 23-page handwritten manual titled "Using Natural Features for Tactical Deception." The manual explained mirror signaling patterns, rope trigger construction, terrain analysis for deception operations, and psychological principles of enemy decision-making. It was written in plain French, illustrated with pencil drawings, and classified top secret by British intelligence. The manual remained classified until 1992, when it was declassified and donated to the Canadian War Museum alongside the mirror and rope. Anyone can read it now. Anyone can learn how a truck driver from Quebec used $2 worth of equipment to kill 93 enemy soldiers and save 800 American lives. The techniques are simple. The physics are basic. The psychology is straightforward. But replicating what Dubois achieved requires something the manual can't teach: the willingness to stay behind enemy lines for 4 days, alone, using weapons that most soldiers wouldn't recognize as weapons, fighting a type of warfare that wouldn't be formally acknowledged for another 20 years. 93 casualties, 0 shots fired, 4 days of operations, $2 in equipment cost, and 2,400 American soldiers who survived the siege of Bastogne, partially because a Canadian truck driver understood that sometimes the best way to kill the enemy was to convince them to kill themselves. The mirror is still in the museum case in Ottawa. The rope is still preserved beside it. And somewhere in special operations training centers across NATO countries, instructors are still teaching techniques that began with a truck driver, a stolen mirror, and the understanding that light and rope could be weapons if you knew how to use them.